Hi, I'm the Guitar Trooper, YouTube's favorite old guy. It's 1957, Liverpool, England, John Lennon's home. 51-year-old Mary Elizabeth Smith, known to her family as Mimi, is finding herself being a soundboard for her nephew John and his best friend Paul as they play for her their first co-written song. She has little enthusiasm for the music that the boys are pursuing, but still, she had provided John with his first guitar because he seemed happier when he was playing it. Paul and John are 16 and 17, and both are competent guitarists. Paul wrote most of the new song based upon the longing for a relationship with an early girlfriend, and John had added in the bridge. Paul counts off the song, and they run through it without stumbling, even throwing in some harmonies, of which they are very proud. They find an ending during the last chorus and look expectantly at Aunt Mimi for some feedback. She thinks just a moment and says, "Well, if you think you're going to make a fortune with that, you've got another thing coming." In a few years, they would begin to prove her wrong. It's early 1960. The Beatles manager, Alan Williams, has booked the guys to play nightly at the Indra Club in Hamburg, Germany, a new establishment designed around the rock and roll music of the day. Between 1960 and 1962, they will play there and at three other clubs, the Kaiser Keller, the Top 10, and the Star, along with other venues in the UK, including Liverpool's The Cavern Club. Even though they routinely share the gigs in Hamburg with several other rock and roll bands, it's a grueling schedule, with the lads having performances sometimes scattered from lunchtime until the early hours of the following day. Well, the work does pay off, though. Besides tightening up their ensemble performance and establishing a signature sound, they can also use appearances to gauge audience reaction to different songs. Among others, one of the songs that they add to their set in early 1962 is the first one written by John and Paul back in 1957. Much to their delight, the audiences approve, building the duo's confidence in their songwriting abilities. It's January 1962. Brian Epstein, record store owner with a desire to begin managing recording artists, has become the new manager for the Beatles. His foremost task is to get the guys a recording deal. The guys are already booked at the Star Club in Hamburg in April for a 7-week hitch, so he gets them to cut a demo tape before they leave that includes 3 of their most popular live performances, and then begins shopping it around to record labels beginning in March. One after another, they turn him down. Only Decca is willing to give them a studio audition, but when the tape is reviewed, they also reject signing the band. However, Brian retains a copy of the session tape. It's May 8, 1962. Through a contact at EMI known by fellow record shop owner Bob Boast, Brian has played the acetate demos of the rejected Decca recordings to Sid Coleman, the general manager of the publishing company for EMI. He is interested enough to recommend a meeting with George Martin, the A&R executive for a small EMI-owned label called Parlophone Records. George's secretary finds a slot for the next day, May 9th, and the meeting is scheduled. On May 9th, George Martin listens to the demo recordings, but isn't very impressed with the songs on them. Still, he finds something intriguing about them and asks if the boys can come in on Wednesday, June 6th, for an evaluation, as George wants to see them in person. As soon as Brian gets out of that office, he sends a telegram with the good news to both the Beatles, who are still in Hamburg and not due back until June 2nd, and to the Merseybeat industry newspaper. It's Wednesday, the 6th of June, 1962, EMI Studios, number 3 Abbey Road, St. John's Wood, London, 7 p.m. The guys, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Pete Best, arrive at EMI Studios. They are relieved and elated, as this is finally the studio that has agreed to a record contract with the Beatles, and they are going to make their first records here. Or so they think. The truth is that this is an artist's evaluation, even though Brian's May 9th telegrams to both them and to the Mersey Beat industry newspaper state that an EMI recording contract has been signed. The contract deal actually is contingent upon the outcome of today's studio performance for George Martin, who felt that the acetate demos that he had heard in May showed some promise. The session's not off to a smooth start. The amplifiers are road-worn affairs that rattle and buzz during use. John's had a persistent rattle that is remedied with a length of twine strategically wrapped around and tied about the side. But Paul's bass amplifier is the worst of the lot, generating a rattle during use that is loud enough to compete with the sound of the instrument being played through it. Engineer Norman Smith raids the studio's echo chamber, retrieving a large tannoy speaker cabinet that he attaches to the output and then rigs an instrument jack with a short soldering job to the input side of a Leak T12 amplifier, and it served the purpose of carrying the bass line without any extra rattles. George Martin has the group play while he rolls tape on 4 songs as recommended by Brian Epstein, but using EMI's lowest grade BTR1 mono recorder on quarter-inch tape. They play Bésame Mucho, P.S. I Love You, Ask Me Why, and the first song that the boys had written in 1957, Love Me Do. By now, Love Me Do, having been played many times in live shows, had been embellished with a harmonica riff played by John that, according to Paul McCartney in an interview, was inspired by the use of the harmonica on the 1961 Bruce Channel hit, Hey Baby. While they felt that it was a great improvement, John, who had been singing all of the lead vocals for that song, couldn't get his mouth on the instrument quickly enough without muffing the Love Me Do line at the end of the verse. Paul was having to sing that line alone while John started the harmonica riff. George Martin, a classically trained musician, was accustomed to working with classically trained drummers. He found Pete Best's playing to be rudimentary and somewhat off time in places, when actually Pete was going for a syncopated rhythm. George still sees real potential for the group, though, and after the lads leave for the day, he discusses them with the technical staff and finally decides to draw up a standard contract, thinking, what have we got to lose? It's Tuesday, the 4th of September, 1962, EMI Studios, 2:30 p.m. After the June 6th session, Paul and John have decided to fire Pete. Well, they actually asked Brian Epstein to do it. And on Thursday, August 6, 1962, Pete is dismissed and they pinch Richard Starkey, known as Ringo Starr, from Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, an act with whom the Beatles frequently shared billing on live gigs. Ringo had gained a reputation among players in Liverpool as one of the best drummers around, and the guys were confident that his playing would improve the studio performance. 90 days after their audition at EMI, the Beatles, now officially under contract, have flown into London Heathrow in the morning and arrive at EMI Studios after lunch. Thanks to a skirmish the previous week at the Cavern Club, George Harrison sports a very noticeable left side black eye. The lads also are now playing their instruments through brand new Vox amplifiers, thanks to an endorsement deal that Epstein had arranged in July. The deal will provide Vox amplification to the band for all appearances and recording sessions, and it will end up remaining in effect until Brian Epstein's death in August of 1967. From 2:30 to 5 p.m., assistant producer Ron Richards has the band rehearse in Studio 3, working on 6 songs, 2 of which are to be chosen for recording during the evening session for their first single. After the rehearsal session, George Martin takes the lads out for an Italian dinner. They then return to EMI and convene in Studio 2 at 7 p.m. The band is set up in a comfortably intimate space inside the cavernous Studio 2, which was originally designed in the 1930s to record orchestras. As per standard EMI practice in the early 1960s, stereo masters are reserved for classical music only. Today's work will be, therefore, mixed to a monaural master on a BTR recorder, even though 4 outputs are available from the REDD 37 mixing desk. Martin wants the band to record How Do You Do It. He wants it very possibly as their first single, and had sent a copy of the composer's demo to them while they were in Liverpool so that they could learn their parts. He insists that it be one of the final candidates for the single. The guys really don't like How Do You Do It, mostly because it isn't their composition, but they make a good take of it, nevertheless.
How do you do what you do to me? I wish
Love Me Do is next. In these days, having a pop artist do overdubbing on a pre-recorded backing track is unusual, as they are far more often doing the entire performance in a single take. But for Love Me Do, in order to have greater control of the quality, Martin has them record a backing track first and then do overdubs for the vocals. The backing track requires 15 takes before a usable track is recorded. The vocal overdub takes considerable time to complete, ultimately running until late in the evening before it's acceptable. After everyone leaves that evening, acetate discs are cut for How Do You Do It and Love Me Do, so that Martin and Epstein can review them the next morning. It's Wednesday morning, September 5th, 1962. George Martin and Brian Epstein listen carefully to both acetates. After due consideration, and despite Martin's original enthusiasm for How Do You Do It, Love Me Do is selected. But still, even with Ringo now on drums, George Martin is not satisfied with the recordings made today, particularly being dissatisfied with the drums, and wants the lads to re-record it. This first record must be the best it can possibly be if the group can be expected to be successful, and that means he must be fully satisfied with every aspect of the master tape. He schedules a session on September 11th to re-record the selections. It's Tuesday, September 11th, 1962. George Martin is unavailable and assigns Ron Richards as the session producer. In a move to improve the drum track, Ron books 32-year-old Andy White, a session drummer that frequently records for EMI, to play drums on the session. Ringo does not find this out until the guys walk into the studio. Andy already knows of the Beatles, as he is married to Lynn Cornell, a singer for another Liverpool group, the Vernon's Girls, and the atmosphere is cordial. White takes his seat behind the drum kit. The first song is P.S. I Love You, recorded in 10 takes with Ringo on maracas, and is selected by Richards for the B-side of the single. Next is Love Me Do, with Ringo dutifully playing a tambourine. The song requires 18 takes before Ron Richards considers it to be sufficient. The session continues on into the evening and then into the early morning hours. At 1 a.m., George Martin shows up to find the band working on a preliminary version of Please Please Me, which is much slower than the final version that we know today. Martin tells them to call it a day and return on another day to record Please Please Me. He also suggests that they increase the tempo when they try it again. With that, the September 11th recording session is complete, and the first single is ready to be mastered with Love Me Do on side A and P.S. I Love You on side B. Love Me Do, the Beatles' first Parlophone single, is released in the UK on October 5th, 1962, and climbs to number 17 in just under 30 days on January 2nd, 1963. Surprisingly, the September 4th recording of Love Me Do with Ringo on drums is preserved and still around on a very few 45 RPM Parlophone records. The Andy White version is used on the Please Please Me album and on other singles, easily distinguishable by the presence of Ringo's tambourine from the September 11th session. Later, Love Me Do will be their fourth number one hit in the U.S. on May 30th, 1964, having been released on April 27th on the VJ Records Tolly label at the height of Beatlemania. Capitol had refused to release it in the U.S. in 1962 because the executives were sure that it would flop. Although the original master was dual track and was then mixed down to mono, a true stereo version was never mixed, and the original dual track recordings were obliterated once the mono mix was completed. Because of this, The 1960s stereo versions of the song were simulated stereo and were the only non-monaural versions available until 2009, when a stereo split of the monaural master was accomplished using digital technology. The only surviving performances from the first June 6, 1962 session, Bésame Mucho and Love Me Do, turned up in private collections decades later, the others having been erased by EMI in 1962 as they were deemed to have no commercial value. Those June 6 recordings were preserved on the Beatles Anthology 1 album. Pete Best, devastated and embarrassed about being sacked, refuses Brian Epstein's proposal for him to join the Mersey Beats. After some legal wrangling regarding Pete's dismissal, Brian secretly arranges for Best to join Lee Curtis and the All-Stars, which subsequently became Pete Best and the All-Stars, and then the Pete Best Four, and they signed to Decca. Unfortunately, their single, If I'm Gonna Knock on Your Door, went nowhere. In 1988, Pete formed the Pete Best Band and released the album Hayman's Green, consisting of all original material to mostly favorable reviews. They booked live performances ever since. Love Me Do was admittedly a very simple song, but it managed to convey the essence of what the Beatles were at the time, and their growing fan base loved it. One can't help but wonder, though, what their career curve would have been like if the Beatles' first single was George Martin's original choice. How do you do it? Hey guys, thanks for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do me a favor and click on that like, thumbs up icon and leave a comment. Let me know what you think. You can also use comments to suggest video subject matter regarding pop music and pop music culture from the 1950s to the 1970s. A great thing you can also do to support the channel is just sharing the video with your friends. Click on the arrow icon and pick the destination person and help us expand the audience. Speaking of supporting the channel, this would be a great time to subscribe if you're not yet a subscriber. It's easy and it's free, and it lets YouTube know that you support the channel. Just click on the subscribe button and be sure to select the top notification bell on the drop-down menu so that you'll be notified whenever I post new content for the public. If you would like the opportunity to see the content a few days earlier when it's viewable only to channel members, you can upgrade your subscription and become one. Just click on the join icon and follow the instructions. It's not free to upgrade, but it's as cheap as YouTube would let me make it. Thanks again for watching.